I'd like to start this lecture. We're going to have two lectures today. One is myself, and the other one is Roland, Professor Walrus Ritter. And given today's date, I just want to see who's dressed up. Nobody? Somebody? I was going to be dressed up, but I decided I'm scary enough the way I am, so I decided there was no need to be dressed up. So listen, guys. The first lecture is called Systems and Incidents, which is a derivation of building systems integration of last year, and I gave a lecture last year about pure technical integration of building systems, and I decided to do something slightly different this year. This is more about design than about the actual integration of technology, and it's about systems in design. I guess you all remember your first year at this school, and if I'm not wrong, there was a story about 3 basic systems of organization of a building. One was going to be a central organization, basically building as an object. The second was a linear organization, if I remember correctly. And the third one was something that we would call a field, a mat, a matrix, something like that. And what I would like to do is to explore the field mat matrix in combination with object design. So what is the relationship between a field and an object? And yeah, I took some interesting quote from Stan Allen's book, Points and Lines, and it says there that the field describes space of propagation of effects. So it's not a definite object or a definite design. It describes a space where something can happen. It contains no matter or material points, rather functions, vectors, and speeds. It describes local relations of differences within fields of celerity, transmission of careering points. In a word, what Minkowski, who was a Ukrainian-German mathematician, called the world. Now, there are some relationships between field conditions and objects, but one thing's for certain: most field conditions, and especially the good ones, are non-hierarchical. That means there's no particular hierarchy set up in those. And some other ones are just not quite recognizable as field conditions, but they are something else. And if you look at these paintings carefully, you will see that I believe, and I think some historians agree with me, that Corbusier only could do his masterly hand on fields, because he was the master of all fields, because he did quite a considerable amount of painting every day and trained his eye with the paintings. And I think that's the only reason, or that's the main reason why his designs in many ways turned out so brilliant. It's another type of field. That's a musical notation from Yanis Xenakis, who, together with Corbusier and Edgar Varèse, was responsible for the famous Philips Pavilion and the Poème électronique that came with the Philips Pavilion, which is another fascinating subject, which unfortunately we can't cover today. That is an example of late 20th century minimalist American art. Agnes Martin, together with many other people, among them Donald Judd and Carl Andre and many others, developed out of the abstract expressionist movement, developed that minimal movement that was famous for developing fields. Or we look into architecture. And the oldest example that comes to mind, or some of the oldest examples, I'm sure there are others that are much older, but a famous example is mosque design. Now, for a reason that I'm not 100% aware of, the Islamic religion saw the interior or sees the interior of a mosque as the entire world that's kind of cut out. So there's the entire world is that kind of field, that kind of grid. So that's the universe is that grid. And then the exterior is kind of limited by those four walls. And of course there's always this large opening in it as well. And here's a very, very interesting example. It's the great Mosque of Cordoba in Spain, which started very early on. And you can see the development in the upper row from right to left, from a very small mosque with an open space and an enclosed space to a larger mosque, even larger. And at the bottom you can see then what happened in the 16th century when they put the Gothic cathedral on top, as you can see in the upper right picture. So this is almost, if you look back at that, that's almost a typical example of a field and incident. So there is this incident of that Gothic cathedral, it's this very object-oriented, very designed object, which has a completely different philosophy to the mosque. Is that, it's a linear building basically. It has like the Catholics believe in that path that leads you to God. So it's a linear thing. So that linear thing is inserted into that field, and we can see in that mosque that actually works quite well. And here's some pictures of today's state of that mosque, which if you have a chance to go to southern Spain and see that mosque, that's one of the highlights of the trip. Or another example from 900 AD, where there is the same kind of setup with a mosque, that field, but what's interesting here is that this is put into another field. That other field is the city itself. And you probably know that in Middle Eastern cities, there's very, very little open space, almost none. There's almost no public space. Most of the spaces are private, and there's only very small streets that are public. So the mosque, as being that big field, not only acts as relief or an opening, it only becomes one of the few public open spaces in the city. You can see that's very, very early, very pure mosque, Ibn Tulun in the middle of Cairo. On the outside, the ring on the outside, that's kind of added to it, is the place where they could put their animals when they were going to the mosque in the early times. Or another example, a little more elaborate, where there's a series of open spaces put together. Beautiful labyrinthic city of Fatehpur Sikri in India. Again, something absolutely a must see when you have a chance to go there. All built out of different fields, and you can see on the detailing, everything is made stone and everything is absolutely gorgeously done. Now let's jump a few hundred years and let's get to one of my favorite field projects. I know the most famous field project of Corbusier is the Venice Hospital, but I decided not to take the Venice Hospital as an example because it's been lectured about so much. And I'm going for the Olivetti Center that was never built, but it's equally interesting, if not more interesting than the Venice Hospital. And it happened at about the same time. But it doesn't mean that Corbusier wasn't interested in fields much earlier than that. As early as 1925, he developed field. There's one famous unbuilt student housing project. I'm not quite sure what it's called, but that's the typical field solution or mat solution. as well as his city plans are, of course. Now what you see here is the site plan. The orange thing is the parking, the red is the freeway, the black are the tall buildings, the light gray is basically the production space, and the dark gray is the access to that production space. So what he did is basically he took all these different circulation systems and took them apart and overlaid them over each other in plan. So for instance, I don't know if you can see that, but on level 1, which is the upper left, what appears to be pink or almost purple on the screen, that is the production space, and the yellow stuff inside is the circulation system, how you get into this production space, or how the internal circulation in that production space works. When you look at the lower right hand, you can see that's level 2, so that's the floor above, and you can see that really, really big yellow axis to the left, and that's where all the workers were supposed to come from. So they basically come along that big street, and they would, number 2, the brown part, restaurants and other functions, and then they would go on top of the production space, as you can see on level 3, and through a series of vertical elements would enter the production space down below. So in other words, there's this. When you look at it geometrically, the production space itself is a regular non-hierarchical field with another field of curved shapes on top which form the entrance, which happens from the top. And finally, you have the third element which completes the design, which is the high-rise buildings that are lying on top of that, the typical office level, which you can see on the lower right-hand side, and upper right you can see there is a section through the production space itself and how the light falls into the production space. Very similar to the Venice Hospital, a lot more expressive than the Venice Hospital, but a very similar system of splitting up the access with the actual stationary part of the program. And here's a model of that. So you can see those 3 systems laying on top of each other. There's no question that he was influenced by the freeway interchange that's next door in the terms of geometry. Or, some people may not call this a field, but I do. Some people may not call it non-hierarchical, but I think it is. Also, there is a very strong division between the different spaces. So what you find here, and that's the parliament in Chandigarh, when you look at Fatehpur Sikri, actually it's not far from Chandigarh, so you can go there. Now, of course, the most important space here is the inner space, the parliament. What's really important formally and composition-wise, though, is that this inner space, the round space of the parliament, doesn't sit in the middle of the building. And what's also very interesting is there is at least 4 different grid systems that form that plan. You can see a grid system on the perimeter. There's one grid system which is not very closely, it's pretty closely spaced. You can see another one for the inside when you look at the inner court, basically, big court. And then you can see a third one that basically just holds up that, it's not a cylinder, it's a, I think it's a hyperbolic, somebody help me, hyperbolic parabola. Hyperbolic parabola. I'm sorry about this. I'm mixing this up with German because it's almost the same, but not quite. So that's basically the interest in this building. And when you look at the sections, and the beautifully drawn sections, by the way, especially the second one, the middle one, and when you look at the picture on the right, you can see, if you study and go back to the plan, you will see that those 3 different systems do not line up with each other. And nevertheless, you can see what kind of beautiful space it makes on the right lower side. Now, we'll jump another 10, 20 years, and we go into a series of utopias that were developed during the 60s, mostly during the 60s, by various groups. And those utopias, they all dealt with systems. They all dealt with fields and maps, and not so much with objects. So this was the time when everybody believed that a city will become an instant city. It was the first time of networking. It was the time when the entire society was full of optimism during the 60s, and everybody was dreaming about the future, and the future looked very good. Now, here is Walking City, Ron Heron, Archigram. Archigram was a group formed in London. Peter Cook, Warren Chalk, Ron Heron, Dennis Crampton, Michael Webb, David Green, and some others formed this group, and they developed those utopian systems for cities. Here's a walking city where basically the city actually moves. The city is on the walk. It's almost like a futuristic sci-fi movie. Moving cities, instant cities. Here another project, plug-in city. So the city could be plugged in. Those structures could be erected over the countryside, and then infrastructure would be put in, and you can see that infrastructure. And those little shapes that you can see going up, they are then the actual offices or housing units. It's a very, very optimistic, very utopian approach. Or a little more cynical, if you would like that, super studio. Those were the first pictures I saw when I decided I wanted to be an architect. 1966 to 1975, Adolfo Natalini and Cristiano Dell'Alto di Francia, they formed that group Super Studio, and basically what they did is a more of a cynical approach. They brought out a good book a few years ago. It's called Life Without Objects. And entirely, there were these walls, grids, and there was no shape whatsoever, no object whatsoever, no design whatsoever. It was everything, the whole world became one system and would be divided into those. Or if you look at this building, you will see that this was very early on by Super Studio, but you probably remember Rem Koolhaas with a very similar picture of, 20 years later. Guess where he got that from? Or this one. Another approach, again from Italy, Archizoom, No Stop City, very, very cynical, even more cynical than the other ones. Kind of playing out capitalism, because the other thing at that time was, of course, that everybody was Marxist and communist, and playing out capitalism to its full extent and see what happens if cities don't stop, cities just go on, like this, in grids, or like that. Living, nature starts to exist within an artificial environment. Nature is being brought back into the artifice. Or somebody who is still alive, Yona Friedman, and less cynical, much more practical, and in a way much more real. I worked on cities where a system would be put up, and then he would rely on user participation to fill in the rest of the city. So he would give a certain framework, and then the users themselves could finish, within that framework, could finish their habitations. But he worked on many things. He even worked, he's propagating, still with his 93 years old, at this point he lives in Paris, he's still propagating his cities, and he's still talking about urban agriculture and things like this that are very, very important in our society and could be a very important factor of sustainable cities. Plan for Paris. Everybody should have a plan for Paris, I guess. And then there was a big movement, and I'm jumping a little back now again, big movement that came out of Corbusier's work, went to the Siam conferences, and then ended up as a split off from Siam, the Team 10. And basically, and I'm not sure I can mention everybody, maybe Graham can help me with it. I mean, it's Hertzberger, Aldo von Eyck, there was Giancarlo De Carlo, there was Ralph Erskine, there was... Yeah, and who else was part of it? So there was of course there was the Smithsons. The Smithsons and Candelis, Josic and Woods. Okay, let me talk how basically what we're getting into here is a little bit of structuralist thinking and structuralist architecture. And what's very interesting about this is, again, it doesn't design objects. It goes away from designing objects and it designs a system. And what's interesting about that approach is that when you design a system, it becomes at the same time very flexible. So whenever you have a building and you think about flexibility or changeability in the future, you want to take some kind of a system approach rather than an object approach, because that thing doesn't only look like it could be added on tomorrow, it can be added on tomorrow. And this is one of Hertzberger's most famous buildings. It's a totally open office building, a central Behir, and consists of a number of pod-like open offices, as you can see here, with an internal street connecting them. Very beautiful environment. It looks a little starch in the pictures, but it's actually quite beautiful and quite nicely to go through. And it's easy to add on. It's easy to change. And, I think that something could be said about sustainable design has to be flexible and has to be easy to change in the future, because it's much less energy consumptive to change a building than to build a new building for the same system. So I think that should be part of that thinking. Another part of that very important group is Candelis, Josic, and Woods. Here's a city plan for Toulouse-le-Marais, a city that they got to plan because they were there was a very progressive mayor in that city, and he let them plan the entire city. And here is an example, the university for 10,000 students in that city. Now, of course, they went on, and after that university, and I want you to maybe when this will be up in the blackboard and other systems, you can look at those plans a little more carefully and look at the different axis system in those plans. But what they ended up designing is the Free University in Berlin. You can see the original plan on the top, and when you look at the bottom, you can see the addition by 2 years ago, the addition by Norman Foster of the Philological Library, the Brain. And you can see the remnants of the original plan actually in the aerial photograph, especially in the lower part below the Brain. And you can see that large courtyard to the right of the Brain, which is the large courtyard in the middle of the original plan. So you can see how things changed in 30, 40 years and how adaptive this building has actually been. Or Allison and Peter Smithson, very, very important couple in this development. Actually, they are the ones that wrote the most about math systems and field systems, and they wrote a number of good articles about it. Or, later on, the Japanese took this on, and I believe that Hensei Dang was present at a number of the Team 10 meetings, and almost became a member of that group. And he then went off to Tokyo and, fascinated by those ideas, developed a new plan for Tokyo, actually at the same time, and it's become very famous for, well, it was never realized, but basically he put the new Tokyo into the Tokyo Bay because there was no room in Tokyo to build. But he put it in a way which is very systematic. You can see the main axis, main circulation, smaller plots, and then of course there's on the upper left side the typical Kensutange elegant forms that he always liked so much. Very aerodynamic. For another guy later on, this whole movement in Japan was later called metabolism. So Japanese metabolism of the 60s, 70s, and partly 80s. I was always dealing with those kind of systems, whether it was the cell system by Kurokawa or the Minoru Takeyama housing project in Japan. Basically what this is, it's just a number of bearing walls and then a system of rectangular modular forms put in different versions on top of those bearing walls and develop what he wanted to do is develop a typical Japanese village feeling with this. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to, at the end of, to conclude my lecture, I'm going to talk about two projects a little bit more in detail. One of them is the library in Alexandria, which I was involved in, and the other one is the Sendai Mediatek by Toyo Ito. Both of them, at different degrees, field or mat buildings. And I will point that out to you while we go through the slides, and I will tell you my opinion. And of course, you can interrupt me if you have different opinions. But here's, for instance, that was the competition model, quite amazing for a competition model of the Toyo Ito Sendai Mediatek. I would almost say that the competition model in this case much more beautiful than the actual real building. But all the elements were there. And what's really important about the building is not the beauty. It's actually how it works. This is a typical building that's divided into floor plates. And if you remember, of course, Rem Koolhaas' book, Delirious New York, must read for everybody in Topic Studio, I think. If you remember that book, he had a whole chapter on the floor plates and what high-rise buildings actually mean, and what floor plates mean when they're divided. And that's exactly what that building does. It picks that up completely. And every floor is a different world in some sense. And the only connection between the floors is through those light wells, which also double as structural elements and sometimes a circulation system. So here you can see that structural system. The upper drawings are that structural system, those light well structural circulation elements put together on each floor. And then on the lower right side you can see an overlapping plan. And you can see how those things overlap from floor to floor. Now what's important to keep in mind here is that that structural system is the only thing that limits the development on every floor. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is how flexible a building with so few structural circulation elements can be for the user of that building, because in the end the user is the one that gets the gain from the building, and if he or she can develop the rest of the floor in almost any possible way, it can only be good. And this is exactly what this building does, as you can see here. So you have those elements sitting there, and you have an empty floor plate in the rest of the building. On the lower right side, you see this is a section through the lighting concept. And then to prove that even further, I'll show you the second floor plan study during construction. And they were kind enough and humorous enough to give us names for each of the plans. So for instance, on the left upper side, irregular plan, amoeba plan, box plan, map plan, weather chart plan, stripe plan. And I guess they went to the, with each of those to the client and said, which one do you want today? And they would pick their plan. But you can only do that if you have a completely open, non-hierarchical, flexible building, and you set it up in a way so that you don't rely on bearing walls, for instance. You rely on as few structural elements as possible, so you have the flexibility to do all this. And here the same story for the 7th floor, the basically different iterations of a similar theme, and almost my favorite graphic element there. Also, it's a trick, of course, because those are fluorescent tubes. That's the ceiling plan on the 7th floor. And those are all the tubes. So what I try to demonstrate here is just how, when you set up a building the right way, especially for something that's changing all the time, I would not fall in love with any of those drawings because they're all pretty much flexible, so they can basically be changed during the life of that building, which is a very good thing. Now, with the Library of Alexandria, it's a slightly different story because there's a lot more limiting elements. And I'm here coming back to what I think is a sort of a combination of the mat or the field with the object. And you know, the way we got the idea, and I remember seeing this before we did the competition for this project. I saw this in the magazine. That time was the most advanced computer chip, 486 or something like that, or 386. That's a wafer. That's actually, each one of those is a chip. And what they do then, they make those tubes out of silicone, and then they cut those tubes and print those chips onto each of the slices. And the reason why it has a flat surface on one side is so that the tube doesn't roll away when it's a tube. And they cut this into wafers. They look like CDs, those wafers, just with a cutoff. And all the little microprocessors are printed on them. And then the wafer gets cut into pieces, and each processor gets put into its place. So this is how to produce it. So what I did, I took that image, and I knew before we did the competition that this could be an image for the roof of the building. So there is the field element, but there's also a very strong limiting element around that field, which is a circle. In a way, it's not so different to the mosque that I showed you that has a very strong surrounding element as a square or rectangle, and the field on the inside being infinite but being limited by that outside shape. And in this case, of course, what makes it a little more complicated is that we decided not only to have that field going and the circle going that limits that field, but also to tilt that field, take that roof and tilt it out of the horizontal, so that part of that field, part of that roof system, if you want, comes to lie low grade, and part of it takes the building above grade. Now, why is that important? The reason why this is important is because, oh no. Okay. Because, and I have to go back here, what it does, it sets up a system by which section and plan interact in a way that cannot be changed. So the angle of the roof is exactly determined, and I'll tell you in a minute why, because the idea was that the diagonal of the grid, and the grid itself comes from the bookshelf. So the bookshelf, we chose the grid in one direction of 960 by 1440 in metric to accommodate 3 different types of bookshelf situations. So, and they could be placed in both directions. So we just took the multiple of those dimensions and made that the grid. And then we decided that the diagonal of that grid would become the opening of the skylight. Now that skylight had to point exactly to the north for the minimum amount of sunlight coming to the building. So that basically set up the direction of that grid in that building and set up the direction of the entire building. So the entire building is set up by the dimension of the bookshelves and by the direction, the orientation to the north and the south. And the picture that I wanted to show you, which is not coming, which is totally white, explains the system why the angle had to be a certain way. Because when you turn a building or when you turn a circle out of the ground, you get a very complicated geometric shape. But we didn't want that. We wanted it to be buildable. And in order to be buildable, it had to be a geometric shape. So we were looking, basically what this explains, and I cannot show it to you unfortunately, what this explains is that if you imagine you take a cylinder with a circular form, a circular cylinder, and cut it other than 90 degrees to the axis, you will get an ellipse. But then if you imagine you take an elliptical cylinder and cut it exactly to a certain angle, you will get a circle. Because there has to be one angle at each elliptical cylinder where you cut it, and the cut will be a circle. And that's exactly the one we had to find in order to have the roof and all the plans to be exact circles, because otherwise it couldn't have been built. And then this is what it looks like when you put that whole system together. Now this is all about the angle of the roof, the grid, the dimension of the bookshelves. So that's all system thing. Now what comes on the inside, and it's very beautiful granite cladding on the wall, and has the letters and scriptures from all the scriptures, or many scriptures in the world. But I really want to show you that. Those are the vertical skylights then that point directly to the north, and they were set up in a way, the way that I described. And I'm really so sorry about this, but I think my drawings are not coming through here. This is the model of the interior. So what I wanted to explain here is that it wasn't just grid, and it wasn't just the system that forms that building. You can see that the circle also forms those spiraling stairs that go up and down the spaces. Now, this was possible because the building basically was so large . I don't know what this is, because it's not happening. No message.
Is there one after that?
Yeah, there's about a lot more, but it's not doing this, and it's also not doing that. Just giving me pieces. So let me. Okay, let's just look at the pictures. Here you can see the two elements here. You can see what I call the system, which is the roof system, which is very regular, very repetitive, and very clear, together with the circular system of the furniture and the bottom and the platforms. So what I would like to advocate is that systems themselves, if you look back at Agnes Martin and you look back at her painting, or you look at some of those cities, systems themselves rarely make a good design. And what I would like to advocate is to mix systems with other elements, so that there's the tension between the system and the object, whether the object is sitting on the outside or the object is sitting on the inside of the field, actually makes a very exciting space. And this is what I'd like to say, and this is basically the message I wanted to give you guys. Thank you.
Do you want to take some questions? I just need a few minutes to save you.
Any questions?